And a federal appeals court rules that President Trump's appointee, Alina Habba, cannot serve as the U.S. Attorney for New Jersey. The Trump administration pushed for Habba to remain in the role after her interim appointment. The court said she needed Senate confirmation. Challenges to Habba's tenure came after people she charged with federal crimes tried to block the charges. They argued she wasn't lawfully in the role after the 120-day interim term had passed.
Okay, so Trump just got absolutely destroyed in court again, and this one is really going to sting because it involves one of his most loyal lawyers and one of his most blatant attempts to install his cronies into positions of power at the Department of Justice. A federal appeals court just delivered a devastating blow to President Trump on December 1st, upholding a lower court ruling that completely disqualifies his personal lawyer Alina Habba from serving as acting U.S. Attorney for New Jersey. The court ruled her appointment was unlawful under federal statutes. There was absolutely nothing the Trump administration could do to spin their way out of this one, no matter how hard they tried. They threw every legal trick in the book at this case. They cited 7 different statutes trying to justify her appointment, and the judges saw right through all of it and called them out for it directly in the ruling itself. This is a complete and total rejection of Trump's attempt to put his personal attorney in charge of federal prosecutions in an entire state. Can you believe this? Like, Trump literally tried to install his personal attorney, the woman who has been defending him in court for years and who is famous for losing cases and getting sanctioned by judges for frivolous arguments, as the top federal prosecutor in New Jersey. And when people challenged it as illegal, the administration threw together this confusing mess of legal arguments, citing multiple different statutes trying to justify why she should be allowed to serve in this incredibly powerful role. And the appeals court looked at all of it carefully and basically said, yeah, none of this works. This is a confusing mix of arguments that does not hold up under any of these designations you are claiming to rely on. This is what happens when you try to force unqualified loyalists into positions they have no legal right to hold just because you want them there. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. Thus, we'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. The Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia was absolutely clear in their ruling and left no room for ambiguity about what they were saying or why they were saying it. They upheld the district court's decision completely without any reservations. They stated that Habba lacks authority to serve as U.S. attorney under any of the designations the administration tried to use to justify her appointment. They reviewed 7 different statutes that the Trump administration cited in their defense, and they rejected every single one of them as a valid basis for keeping her in that position. This was not a close call where reasonable people could disagree. This was not a split decision where judges disagreed about the law. This was a complete and total rejection of Trump's attempt to circumvent federal law to install his personal lawyer in a powerful prosecutorial role where she could protect him and go after his enemies. And here's the thing that makes this even more embarrassing for Trump and his legal team and shows how poorly they handled this entire situation from the beginning. The lower court judge, Judge Brand, had already made it crystal clear in his prior ruling exactly what the problem was with this appointment and why it could not stand under federal law. He emphasized that presidential appointments remain subject to the time limits and power-sharing rules laid out in federal law that Congress established for a reason.
President Trump's former personal lawyer is unlawfully serving as New Jersey's top federal prosecutor. Alina Habba's authority as the state's acting U.S. attorney is challenged by 2 defendants who faced federal drug trafficking charges. Well, their attorney sought to block those charges, arguing Habba did not have the authority to prosecute the cases after her 120-day term as interim U.S. attorney expired in July. The judge's decision is expected to be appealed.
In other words, you cannot just appoint whoever you want to these positions and ignore the laws that govern how these appointments work just because you are the president. There are rules that apply to everyone. There are limits on presidential power. And Trump does not get to ignore them just because he wants his personal lawyer running prosecutions in New Jersey, where he has all kinds of legal exposure and business interests that could benefit from having a loyalist in charge. The lawyers representing the challengers in this case were absolutely brutal in their characterization of what the Trump administration was trying to do here, and they did not hold back at all. They accused the administration of running a deceptive strategy to retain Habba in power, despite the clear legal problems with her appointment that should have been obvious from the start. They said this was not a good faith disagreement about how to interpret the law or a close legal question. This was a deliberate attempt to get around the rules by throwing every possible legal argument at the wall and hoping something would stick long enough for her to stay in position. And the appeals court agreed with that characterization by rejecting every single argument the administration made and upholding the ruling that kicked Haba out of that position once and for all. All right, so let me really dig into what happened here and why this ruling matters so much, because I think a lot of people do not fully understand how significant this case is for Trump's broader efforts to control the Department of Justice and use it as a weapon against his enemies and a shield for his friends and allies. This is not just about one lawyer losing one job that she wanted. This is about whether the president can ignore federal law to install his personal attorneys in positions where they can control who gets prosecuted and who gets protected from prosecution. And the appeals court just delivered a really clear answer to that question. No, he cannot do that. And the laws that govern these appointments actually mean something and must be followed even by the president. Let me give you some background on how we got here, because the story of how Alina Habba ended up in this position in the first place is pretty wild and tells you a lot about how this administration operates when it comes to staffing the government with Trump loyalists rather than qualified professionals. Habba is probably best known as one of Trump's personal lawyers who has represented him in various civil cases over the years, including some high-profile ones that did not go particularly well for her or her client. She has been sanctioned by judges for making frivolous arguments that wasted the court's time. She has lost major cases that she should have been able to win, and she has been criticized by legal experts for her courtroom performance on multiple occasions throughout her career representing Trump in various legal matters. But none of that mattered to Trump, because what he values above all else is loyalty. Not competence, not qualifications, not experience. Just pure personal loyalty to him and willingness to do whatever he asks. And Habba has demonstrated that loyalty over and over again by defending him publicly and aggressively, no matter what the circumstances were or how bad the facts looked. So when Trump took office for his second term and started looking for people to install in key DOJ positions, Habba was an obvious choice for him, despite the fact that she had no experience as a prosecutor and no obvious qualifications for running a U.S. attorney's office in a major state like New Jersey with one of the busiest federal court districts in the entire country. He wanted loyalty, and she had proven she was loyal. The problem is that federal law has specific rules about how acting officials can be appointed and how long they can serve in those roles before they need to be confirmed by the Senate or replaced. These rules exist for a very important reason: to prevent presidents from circumventing the Senate confirmation process and installing whoever they want in powerful positions without any oversight or accountability from the legislative branch. The Vacancies Act and other federal statutes lay out exactly who can serve in acting roles and under what circumstances and for how long they can remain in those positions. And the Trump administration apparently decided they did not need to follow those rules when it came to Habba because they wanted her in that position regardless of what the law said about who could serve there. When challengers sued to block Habba's appointment, the administration responded by citing a whole bunch of different statutes and claiming that under one or more of them her appointment was valid and should be allowed to stand. They threw everything at the wall, hoping something would stick and justify what they had done. They cited the Vacancies Act. They cited other appointment statutes. They made arguments based on multiple different legal theories that contradicted each other. And the result was what the appeals court called a confusing mix of designations that did not actually justify her serving in the role under any of the laws they cited. It was a legal mess that showed they had no coherent legal basis for what they were doing, and the courts saw through it completely. Judge Brand's ruling at the district court level was really important because it established the principle that is now being upheld by the appeals court and will govern future cases like this. He made clear that presidential appointments remain subject to the time limits and power-sharing rules laid out in federal law regardless of who the president is or what they want. This might seem obvious. Of course, presidents have to follow the law when making appointments just like everyone else. But the Trump administration has been operating as if those rules do not apply to them because they are special. They have been trying to install loyalists through various workarounds and legal tricks, rather than going through the proper confirmation process that the Constitution requires. And Judge Brand said, no, you cannot do that. The laws actually mean something, and you have to follow them. The appeals court ruling on December 1st upheld everything Judge Brand said and added their own emphatic rejection of the administration's arguments that left no doubt about where they stood. The Third Circuit reviewed all 7 statutes the administration cited as justification for Habba's appointment, and they rejected every single one of them as a valid basis for her serving in that role. They stated clearly that Habba lacks authority to serve as U.S. attorney under any of those designations, no matter which statute you look at. This was not a narrow ruling on a technicality that could be fixed with a small change. This was a comprehensive rejection of the administration's entire legal strategy for keeping her in that position. And it sends a very clear message that the courts are not going to let Trump ignore federal appointment laws just because he wants to install his friends. The characterization from the lawyers challenging the appointment was particularly damning and worth paying attention to because it captures what is really going on here and why this matters so much. They accuse the administration of running a deceptive strategy to retain Haba in power despite knowing the appointment was improper. Think about that language for a second. Deceptive strategy. They are saying the Trump administration was not making good faith legal arguments about how to interpret appointment statutes. They are saying the administration knew what they were doing was improper from the beginning and tried to deceive the courts by throwing out multiple conflicting legal theories, hoping to confuse the issue enough that Haba could stay in position until they figured something else out. And the appeals court implicitly agreed with that characterization by rejecting every argument and upholding the ruling without hesitation. This case is almost certainly headed to the Supreme Court now because the Trump administration is not going to accept this loss without a fight, and they have the resources to keep appealing forever. But here is the thing. The appeals court ruling was so clear and so comprehensive in rejecting every argument that it is hard to see how the Supreme Court could reverse it without essentially saying that federal appointment laws do not mean anything at all. Even conservative justices who are generally sympathetic to executive power have to recognize that there are limits on what presidents can do, and ignoring clear statutory requirements about appointments would set a dangerous precedent that applies to future presidents of both parties, including Democrats. This connects to all the other DOJ controversies we have been tracking throughout Trump's second term that show a clear pattern of behavior. We have talked about his demand for $230 million from the DOJ as payment for being investigated during his first term. We have talked about the investigations into Democratic lawmakers for reminding military members about refusing illegal orders. We have talked about the Supreme Court case about firing independent agency heads. All of these stories are connected by a common thread. Trump wants to control the DOJ completely and use it for his personal and political benefit without any checks or limits. And the courts and the institutions are pushing back in various ways to try to maintain some limits on that control. Okay, so let us break this down into the key points you need to understand because there is a lot happening here, and I want to make sure you walk away from this video knowing exactly what this ruling means and why it matters for Trump's presidency and for the broader fight over control of the Department of Justice that is going to define this administration. Point number 1. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a lower court ruling that completely disqualifies Alina Habba from serving as acting U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, finding that her appointment was unlawful under federal statutes governing how these positions can be filled by any president. The appeals court reviewed 7 different statutes that the Trump administration cited as justification for her appointment, and they rejected every single one of them as a valid basis for her serving in that role. The court stated clearly that Habba lacks authority to serve as U.S. Attorney under any of those designations no matter how the administration tried to frame it. This was not a close call or a narrow ruling on some technicality. This was a comprehensive rejection of the administration's entire legal strategy for installing Trump's personal lawyer in a powerful prosecutorial position. Point number 2. This ruling reinforces the principle that presidential appointments remain subject to federal law, even when the president really wants to ignore those laws to install his loyalists in positions of power. Judge Brand's original ruling emphasized that appointments remain subject to the time limits and power-sharing rules laid out in federal statutes that Congress passed for good reasons, and the appeals court upheld that principle completely without any reservations. Trump cannot just put whoever he wants in these positions by coming up with creative legal theories after the fact. There are actual rules governing how acting officials can be appointed and how long they can serve in those roles. And those rules apply even when the president finds them inconvenient for his goal of stacking the DOJ with people loyal to him personally, rather than to the Constitution. Point number 3. The lawyers challenging the appointment accused the Trump administration of running a deceptive strategy to retain Habba in power, and the appeals court implicitly agreed by rejecting every single argument the administration made in her defense. This was not characterized as a good faith disagreement about how to interpret appointment statutes where reasonable people could disagree. The challengers said the administration knew what they were doing was improper from the start and tried to create confusion by citing multiple conflicting legal theories, hoping something would stick long enough to keep her in place. The fact that the appeals court rejected all 7 statutory arguments suggests they saw through this strategy completely and were not impressed by the administration's attempts to work around the clear requirements of federal law. Point number 4. This case is likely headed to the Supreme Court, but the appeals court ruling was so clear and comprehensive that it will be very difficult to reverse without essentially saying federal appointment laws are meaningless pieces of paper. Trump will almost certainly appeal because he does not accept losses and he wants Haba in that position, controlling prosecutions in New Jersey. But the Third Circuit left no ambiguity about their reasoning and rejected every possible basis for her serving in the role. For the Supreme Court to reverse this, they would have to either find new legal arguments the administration did not make, or decide that the appointment statutes do not actually mean what they clearly say. Even conservative justices may be reluctant to go that far and set that kind of precedent. Point number 5. This connects to the broader pattern of Trump trying to take control of the DOJ through appointments and the courts pushing back on his most aggressive moves throughout his second term. We have seen him demand $230 million from the DOJ for investigating him. We have seen investigations into Democratic lawmakers for political speech. We have seen the Supreme Court case about firing independent agency heads. All of these stories are about Trump wanting to control federal law enforcement completely and use it for his personal benefit. The Haba ruling is another example of the court saying, there are limits. You have to follow the law, even if you are the president, and even if you really do not want to. So, what happens next, and where does this story go from here? The Trump administration will almost certainly appeal to the Supreme Court because that is what they do with every loss. They keep fighting until they run out of options, and sometimes even after that. The question is whether the Supreme Court will even take the case given how clear and comprehensive the appeals court ruling was in rejecting every argument. If they do take it, the arguments will be closely watched for signs of how the conservative justices view presidential appointment power and whether they are willing to let Trump ignore federal statutes to install his personal lawyers in prosecutorial positions. In the meantime, Haba cannot serve as acting U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, which is a significant blow to Trump's control over federal prosecutions in that state. New Jersey is important because it is where a lot of Trump's business interests are located and where he has potential legal exposure on various matters. Having his personal lawyer running the U.S. Attorney's office there would have been incredibly convenient for him, and the courts have now blocked that from happening. The political implications are significant as well because this reinforces the narrative of cronyism and unqualified appointments that has been dogging the Trump administration throughout his second term. He tried to install his personal lawyer, someone with no prosecutorial experience who is famous for losing cases and getting sanctioned, as the top federal prosecutor in a major state. And the court said, no, you cannot do that. That is going to be a talking point for Democrats heading into the midterms, and it makes it harder for Republicans to defend the administration's personnel decisions. This also shows that the institutional guardrails are still functioning to some degree, even as Trump tries to demolish them and get around every rule that limits his power. The courts are still willing to enforce federal law against this administration, even when it makes the president angry. Judges appointed by presidents of both parties are still ruling based on what the statutes actually say, rather than just rubber stamping whatever Trump wants. That is important, because if the courts stop being a check on executive overreach, then there really is nothing standing between Trump and complete control over the entire federal government. Keep in mind that this is just one case in a much larger fight over control of the DOJ and the federal government more broadly that will continue for years. Trump will keep trying to find ways to install loyalists in key positions. He will keep pushing the boundaries of what is legal, and the courts will keep having to decide case by case whether to let him do it or to enforce the laws as they are written. So far, the courts are pushing back more than Trump expected, but the fight is far from over. Keep watching because this story is developing and there will be more court battles to come. I will be covering all of it. I will see you in the next one.